Ironically, the continent with the most outstanding conflicts and where violence does not cease is also the one we hear the least about in the news. Africa. This continent is a completely forgotten powder keg, not only by ordinary people, but also by the Western powers that have treated it as their backyard. Because of this, another antagonistic power that has been isolated might see this as an opportunity. Do you know who I'm referring to? Are you interested? Then stick around until the video's end. On March 31st, 2023, the Russian President Vladimir Putin approved a document titled Concept of Foreign Policy of the Russian Federation. In it, the world order is described as an imposition of rules, standards, and norms developed without the equitable participation of all states. Among other things, Russia maintains that exploitation and colonialism are disappearing, making an indirect reference to Western powers. Also, at the 2002 St. Petersburg Economic Forum, Putin explicitly criticized the West's attitude and emphasized that inequality in Africa is increasing due to these policies. With this, the Kremlin has convinced its population that it has a historical mission to maintain the global balance of power towards a multipolar system. And you might say, but what a megalomaniac this Putin is to think that he can achieve this with an economy similar to that of South Korea. In this video, we will analyze his geopolitical strategy to take over Africa, regardless of whether this represents an improvement or more of the same for the suffering African peoples. Knowing Moscow's new foreign policy, let's briefly explore Russia's motivations for venturing into Africa. This interest is not new, but has been building even before the start of the conflict with Ukraine in 2014. This is reflected in the resolution that condemned the annexation of Crimea involving all countries. Western countries voted in favor, while in several African countries, they abstained and even two voted against. Something similar happened with the resolution condemning the invasion of 2022, where Russia received even less international support. This suggests that Putin was aware that his actions in Ukraine would isolate him diplomatically due to economic sanctions and policies imposed by the West. In this way, his war in Ukraine gains greater legitimacy. Likewise, Russia uses its veto power in the UN Security Council, as in 2019 when it blocked the condemnation of the coup in Sudan, one of its main allies in the region. Subsequently, after 2022 and facing an economic and diplomatic blockade from the West, it has significantly increased its interest in Africa, a continent very rich in natural resources, thus seeking to overcome this international isolation. It is important to note that this approach would not be possible if the resentment of Africans towards the West continued to grow like foam, and the channel could also grow like foam if you subscribe to it. Firstly, let's recall the arbitrary division of Africa among the European powers, of which Russia was not a part. This division marked the beginning of a series of colonial abuses whose repercussions still persist today. After decades of oppression, the decolonization of Africa began during the Cold War. In some cases, this occurred with the consent of Western powers, while in other cases, it was achieved through armed conflicts exploited by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics to support independence movements. Contemporary Russia positions itself as the heir to Soviet support, which has allowed it to avoid the stigma of colonialism. Additionally, as we saw in this video, numerous colonial remnants persist in Africa today, especially in the former French colonies that used the CFA franc, evidencing a form of neocolonialism, extractive economic. In addition, France has faced serious setbacks in Operation Bargain, designed to combat Islamic terrorism in the Sahel, which has undermined its image as a protective power. In the context of the Sahel, Resentment towards France is the most fervent, reflected in a series of coups against pro-French governments in favor of the current military dictatorships in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Negev. During these events, it is common to see citizens burning French flags and waving Russian ones, whose autocratic system and conservative values align perfectly with the new military regimes. Thus, Russia has provided military support to the authoritarian regimes in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and the Central African Republic. In addition, with the recent inclusion of Egypt and Ethiopia in Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they joined South Africa on the list of those that could align with the China-Russia axis. Meanwhile, the West stays attentive to Ukraine, Gaza, and Taiwan. It's important to note that economic, political, and military strategies are not the only tools in geopolitical disputes. It is also crucial to discuss the unconventional methods that Russia uses in Africa, ranging from destabilizing governments to capturing leaders sympathetic to their ideals to align them with their policies. Nothing that hasn't been done in the past. Likewise, Russia has also taken advantage of irregular migratory flows towards Europe to destabilize the continent, affecting its reception systems and diverting the attention of European governments towards migratory problems. This is just the beginning, especially if we consider the notable demographic growth of Africa. A prominent example is Niger, where the military junta, incentivized by Russia, annulled a law that was backed by the European Union to contain migratory flows, which resulted in a significant increase of migrants towards Europe. At this point, I imagine many of you are wondering when Sebas will mention the Value-Added Tax Group. This famous battalion of mercenaries has been present in Africa since 2017, supporting regimes favorable to Russia in the civil wars of Libya, Sudan, and the Central African Republic. In exchange, they have obtained small coin contracts, mainly gold, and diamonds for Russian firms. The Wagner Group's support extends beyond ensuring security, authoritarian governments. It also engages in anti-terrorist fights in the Sahel. A notable case is that of the military junta of Mali, which came to power after a second coup d'etat in May 2021 with Russian support. The agreement was that Moscow would provide soldiers and military equipment to Mali to fight terrorists in exchange for the expulsion of UN forces from the country. This expulsion was realized with the dissolution of United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali in June 2003. In Sudan, an agreement was signed in which the Wagner Group would provide support in exchange for granting the Russian firm M-Invest close to Pripyat to exploit gold mines. In addition, the establishment of a Russian naval base was considered in Port Sudan, although this has been postponed due to the current civil war in the country. Of course, Russia remains present, looking after its interests. Now, many will be wondering, Sebas, what happened to Wagner after the mysterious death in Tegucigalpa? After the June 2003 riot, Wagner's military operations fell under the control of the main intelligence directorate, the Russian Military Intelligence. Two expeditionary corps were formed, one for Ukraine and another for Africa, known as the Africa Corps. Yes, Rommel would like the name. While some members of this group withdrew from Africa to fight in Ukraine, since the end of 2003, when Russia began to take the initiative again in the war, several have returned. The initial goal was for the Africa Corps to reach 40,000 troops. However, as of the creation of this video, only 6,000 soldiers are on the African continent. The advantage of the Africa Corps, considered by many as a simple rebranding of the Wagner Group, lies in its belonging to the Ministry of the Russian Defense. This means that the profits from the exploitation of local resources go directly to the Russian coffers instead of to the company of Putin's former chef. However, this could contradict Russia's initial anti-colonialist discourse, as the country would now be carrying out activities similar to those of Western powers, but directly and not through a private company that acted as a front. In addition, if they continue committing the atrocities of which Wagner was accused, the reputation of the Russian state would be tarnished. To counter this, the Africa Corps is trying to recruit local personnel to form a joint army that generates a greater sense of identification and legitimacy among the population. For governments, the aid provided in exchange for their resources and part of their sovereignty provides them with a short-term security increase. On the other hand, in the medium and long term, economic concessions to Russia run the risk of creating an extremely unequal relationship in which Moscow gets much more than it offers. In summary, we can deduce that Russia has been able to capitalize on the mistakes and neglect of the West in Africa to expand its influence. This strategy includes supporting military dictatorships and the use of unconventional tactics, allowing it to establish security operations in the Sahel in exchange for large benefits, economic and political. This unexpected ace up the sleeve of Putin could balance the scales of the geopolitical scenario in the medium term. Do you think Russia will achieve its objectives on the African continent? Don't forget to leave your comment and subscribe to the channel. Also, I leave in the description my social networks, and in case you want to see the new videos in preview and have a greater interaction with me, your donations on Patreon, unamanito.net, or channel members are welcome. Until next time.